Well, good morning, everyone. Darren Doherty is my name. We're very, very blessed this morning on our Regrarians talk session to have none other than Byron Joel with us.
Cue applause.
Yes, we do get applause at this point, Byron, which you can give yourself. It's always good to hear the sound of one person clapping.
Yeah.
There we go. So now a lot of you will see that I'm clearly not Byron Joel because you'd be knocked over by the very sight of this man, of course, who shares part of his time being a great musician, and anyone who's listened to Byron's music would know that he's not far off, and looks great in big hair pants, I hear. So
not at 5:30 a.m. he doesn't.
Not at 5:30 a.m. We're very appreciative of Byron being able to join us this morning as well, because he's in Perth in Western Australia, the most remote city on the planet. And he's up at 5:30, which for a rock star is a lot of fun. So
I haven't gone to bed yet.
He hasn't gone to bed. Very good.
That's how we do it over here. But thank you very much for having me. I appreciate being on. I look forward to it.
Yeah, well, it's good to see you in the darkness there, mate.
Yeah.
So you got a lot going on, and I think your story's a really great one to talk about, because a lot of people are going to look at your story as being not that similar to their own, where they're kind of living in two worlds a bit. And that's what strikes me about your story as much as anything else. I mean, you have a great talent and passion for music and ability. And but then you also have a great passion and ability for land design and horticulture, in which you trained and all of that. So talk to me about how you play those two parts in your life at the moment.
Okay, well, music is something I'm getting back into. When I had kids, I used to be in a band. That was my bread and butter, actually, in my 20s. And that was great. It was really expressive, and it's always come very easy to me. And then when I had kids, I put it on the shelf. And but recently it's coming back. I've decided to go and take all these old songs that I've written and make a record out of it. But I've always felt like it's my primary function as kind of artist or musician. I'm a musician who's into landscape design.
Yeah.
And not the other way around, although I'm very passionate about my role as landscape designer and horticulturalist and all things under that umbrella. But the music is something that I don't even have to try. It just kind of happens really easily. I really enjoy it. It's quite meditative the way I do it. So I'm really grateful that I'm able to do what I'm doing now, which is to record an album, and I'm a few tracks in, and it's getting mastered, and I'm really pleased with where it's going, and I've no idea what will happen from it. It actually occurred to me just this week, as the tracks have been getting kind of close to completion, that other people are actually going to hear it, which is
we've been blessed enough that you've shared some of that with us, and it's exceptional, mate. I can't say anything more than that. I mean, we love your sound, and we love you, but we love your sound, and it'd be great to. And it's I think you represent quite a lot of great, or what I would call the great sound of the West. There's a whole number of great performers who've come from the West with a very particular style, and I think you represent that.
Thank you. It's been said a bit. West Australia is a bit strange. I mean, for a state, what is it, like 3 or 4 times the size of Texas, with a total population of, I think, about 3.5 million. There's a lot of really good music that comes out of WA and Perth, like, all the way up to like AC/DC and whatnot. So there's something in the water over here.
Trends.
And trends?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of trends that come out of Western Australia. There's a lot of surf culture trends that have come out of there, and
Right.
And I think acting culture. I mean, you look at there's been a number of actors who've come out of Western Australia, most notably Heath Ledger, of course, but a number of others
Yeah.
before him with the Academy over there, and there's very much a particular style that comes.
Yeah. Okay.
An
That's true.
authenticity. Yeah. Lisa and I have often talked about that, her being an actor, and there's a great academy over there. So yeah, look, and I think it's the way I look at Western Australia. Western Australia is the closest thing to a land-based island,
Absolutely.
in a way, because it is, it's got there's literally thousands of kilometres of desert between you and the next
Yeah.
bit of civilization in this country.
It's true. It's not just isolated in terms of like, demographic proximity to other large cities. Perth, I'm talking about the southwest in general. It is an island of green between the Indian Ocean and the desert, and even the species are different. Like wombats didn't get to cross the Nullarbor, or well, if they did, they're not here anymore.
No.
There's a number of different species. We don't have wombats. We don't have koala. It's quite different indeed.
So you grew up in a family, your family in a way is a little bit similar to mine, although your father did come back from Vietnam, whereas mine didn't.
Yes.
You're 13 years younger than me, and your father was a landscaper. Am I correct in calling him that?
He became one later. He started off with irrigation.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you grew up that you would have apprenticed to him.
Yeah.
And
It's funny, like I didn't apprentice per se, because by the time that I worked with him, his company, he wasn't on the shovel, so to speak. But I can remember being 12 years old and having to, it was like the primary school graduation, and you had to write a little thing about what you did or didn't want to do. And I wrote, and Byron Joel definitely does not want to be an irrigation consultant. And everyone.
What did you say you wanted to do?
I can't remember what I did want to do, but it's funny, because I did the usual kind of punk kid thing and rebelled against mum and dad, and I just wanted nothing to do with what dad was doing. And now, of course, I ring him and email him on a regular basis because he's an absolute walking encyclopedia when it comes to all things irrigation, which is pretty handy.
Very, very.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure he's probably pretty stoked that you've come back around as well.
Yeah, it's nice. It's nice having that little working relationship. He helps me out. It's good. And just because he's got, I don't take naturally to the kind of back of house side of business. Well, and he's just an excellent businessman.
Yeah.
So it's just lovely having that mentorship from him. It's great.
So back on the music front and that balance that you've trying to strike there, how do you? Well, how are you going with that, personally and professionally?
Well, personally, I've realized how much I miss it, because it was more than me enjoying strumming a guitar. It was really my way of de-stressing, and I would strap on a guitar and walk along the Swan River for hours and hours and hours. And in fact, I did that for years and years. And most of the songs that I'm recording at the moment are from that era. And
so how old were you then?
22.
Yeah, right.
Like they're old. These are old songs. These have been floating around my head for way too long. And so then I would occasionally, get opportunity to kind of record these little demos on my computer. And because I had no idea that anyone would ever hear them, they were just kind of these spontaneous little things I did for myself. But the vibe of them ended up being quite intimate and spontaneous. And I didn't know how I'd recreate that in the studio. So I took them to my friend, Dave Mann. He's a producer. And he said, well, why don't we'll use them? We'll actually use these demos with these funny sounds on them. So that's what we've done, and just been building that in the studio over the last few months. I have no idea how I'll make it work professionally, if at all. Like I have no idea what will happen. I could put a record out and nothing will happen. I'd prefer to gig it. I want to perform it with friends, but it's new. I haven't done it in 15 years, so I have no idea.
So it's interesting you say the floating around in your head is as a designer as well. Is there a few concepts that you've carried on, visions? Because I'm not a musician, so I can't imagine, but is music like carrying a vision for a landscape, for example?
Oh, yeah, very much, actually. Yeah, it's very much a landscape. There's an aesthetic and there's a feel to it. And I see music very much in my head. Like I have lots of like kind of colors and shapes associated with music in my head. So I've got a really clear idea of what I want to create with this album. There's a resource and time restraint because studios are so bloody expensive. But yeah, it is a kind of a similar faculty. I remember you saying once that you had, I think when we were in California, you were saying that we went for a walk one day at Aurelia and you came back and just kind of mapped out what you'd seen, and it was incredibly precise. You know, like I don't know if you call it a photographic memory, but your mind for a memory for landscape is quite pronounced. I don't have that memory so much with landscape, but I do with music. But it's a similar faculty though, I'd imagine.
Yeah, that's really interesting because it's both are about pattern. So the big things that I remember that I have a really strong memory for are faces, which is a pattern recognition as a landscape, landscapes themselves, and species names for some strange reason.
Yeah.
I was at my cousin's yesterday, and he had a bottle of prickly pear, and I just as soon as I saw the prickly pear jam, I went Cactoblastoris cactorum, and I don't know where the hell that came from, but what the hell is that all about? But I felt, and in talking to you this morning, thinking that, all right, well, so you're 36, 37 now. You've had these songs sitting there for 16, 17 years when you're in your early 20s. It is kind of like that memory, and that's the power of the pattern of song, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I mean, that's song. I mean, that's why they use jingles on ads to get into your brain. But the other thing I find as well that really helps with remembering is to have a kind of a system. So I'm pretty good with Latin names as well, the plants, but it's when I appreciated that system of binomial nomenclature and taxonomy, the genus, species. It gave me a filing cabinet which to put them all. And it's the same with like even landscape now. When I read a landscape and I have that kind of, I use a kind of keyline nomenclature to describe landscape. Once you've got that meta system in which to file things, it's just I guess that's how the human mind works. It just makes it so much easier to recall.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and there's some similarities between us on that, I suppose. Where you're trying to break things down, but again on the music, the way you can. Do you think a song that you create yourself imparts a better memory than one that someone else has created?
To me, does it act as a trigger to me? Sort of, because I don't. How do I explain this? I don't write songs like actively. So I won't sit down and work on a song. Like I will have something my hands will do, or I'll come up with like a little thing, like a chord progression or something, and that may sit isolated in the back of my mind for 5 years until one day I happened to be strumming it, and then I put another piece with it, and they form very slowly. And it's the same with lyrics. Like I don't consciously write them. They kind of just flow out of me, stream of conscious. And I have no idea what they mean most of the time. I can go back and reread them and go, oh yeah, that's about this probably, or about that. But they don't really stick to moments. I use music to kind of, there are things that we're like immediately, actively, consciously aware of in our day-to-day experience, and then there are those things that kind of whisper off in the background, these kind of, the deeper things that are harder to get at, and that's what I use music to explore. It's kind of like a fishing net trying to catch butterflies with
Yeah.
So they don't trigger anything in terms of memory, but feeling. Like it's this color and shape and aesthetic and atmosphere.
So is in the way that you construct your music, is there any similarity between that and the way that you would construct a landscape plan, or is that just a much more mechanical process, do you think?
I think I have a mechanical process thanks to the Regrarians platform, registered trademark. But,
of course.
But I use that now like second nature. Like I don't really have to think. It's just like, oh, of course, like it's the hierarchy of decision making within that enterprise. But I do in that and I guess maybe sometimes I have to be a bit careful not to be a bit too romantic about it. There is a functionality, of course, a strong one within landscape design, especially with agricultural production is involved. But I get a bit romantic about it, and I'm really interested in creating ambience and that the beauty of landscape and broad scale landscape. So yeah,
that's really
there is a similarity.
Yeah, I think we've talked about this before. I know where there's it's sort of like it is a tension. There's a few tensions involved there. You touched on one of them, is that you've got the practical side of a agricultural landscape having to make money and having to be feasible. And you have a client whose brief you're responding to, because in large part you're still creating something for someone else as opposed to them being a full participant in the process. Like in our case now, we've handed everything over, or a lot of it over to the client to do, and with us sort of being a facilitator. That's not always the case, but it is in large part. But you're still from the work that I've seen online and whatnot, you're still doing the plans for people. So there's a lot more in your plans. There's a lot more of you in your plans than there is, say, of me in my plans these days, because I've sort of handed that over. Over to people to make their own music, as it were. So do you think with that? And I was talking to someone the other night. We had one of the world's most famous hula hoop performers. She was given a gig. She's from Chicago, and Rachel.
Yeah, I actually, funnily enough, saw that.
Post. Yeah, she's very fun. Well, I didn't realise I'd never heard of her before. But anyway, of course, because I'm such a hula hoop aficionado. I did. I gave it one go, and it dropped suddenly to the floor.
Okay.
I have got a mild back complaint at the moment, though, Byron. I'll use that as an excuse. But she launched, we were having dinner, and she launched straight into a zodiac reading thing. And of course, then I had to ring my mother and find out what time of the morning I was born. And
so you now know your ascendant.
Well, well, this is the thing, and I found.
Aren't you're a Libran sun. You got
Well,
you got a vertigo moon?
oh God, you know more about this than I do, mate. I couldn't remember. All that I can remember were parts, which I think I might be taking the piss. That my moon might be in my my moon is in my Uranus.
Oh right, yeah.
Yeah, so
Ba-dum.
yeah, but the upshot of it was she said that with my sign that that beauty is that I should be seeing a lot. I should see beauty in my design,
Yeah.
and that's one of the primary. And I thought, yeah, and I don't do much of it anymore. That's the thing. So it was sort of, I thought, well, I don't do much design anymore. And I'm thinking, with you, you still are doing design, and you're still making music, and you're an athlete. That's clear.
Yeah.
And an expression of that is your vision of Dehesa Australis and Regen Australis, and I'd like to explore that a bit more with you.
Sure, nice segue.
Because well, I do what I can.
Yeah.
Lengthy segue, but
Go on.
It is me.
Yeah. Librans,
verbose Librans. So tell us about what's the distinction between Dehesa Australis and Regen Australis as a starting point?
Okay, what is the distinction? Okay, Dehesa Australis is a particular project that's actually nested within Regen Australis. So Dehesa Australis is me appreciating that of all the different subsets of study and whatnot that we can tackle within all these associated areas, perennial staple crops are something that I'm really passionate about. I won't go into. I'll assume that people listening to this have some idea of what I'm talking about when I say a perennial staple crop, and in particular, trees that produce a heavy carbohydrate, protein, or fatty fruit or nut that, again, in particular, will drop during the autumn feed gap. Mm-hmm. So that's a pretty, that narrows it down a bit, but it's based on the Dehesa systems of Iberia. Mm-hmm. For those who aren't aware, the Dehesa are it's a semi-domesticated, broad-scale agricultural system, silvopastoral system, in which stock animals are run on the rangelands, which are overstood by a lightly densed oak tree canopy of two oak species, Ilex and Suba. And there's a whole suite of extra environmental benefits that come from that system, and a whole suite of, there's horticultural and tourism, and there's all sorts of things that the Spanish have done. They've been really creative with leveraging those systems.
More recently, yes, yeah.
More recently, because they've had to be creative.
Yeah.
And looking at Australia with such similar climates in many cases, the Mediterranean climates, it made sense to apply here. I coined the term off Paul Ward, but I first heard it from you. And I remember when I first heard it, you were doing a keyline talk at Whoop Whoop, WA, one of those.
Oh yeah, that one. Yeah, I know the one. Yeah.
Yeah, and you walk through just a little kind of, silver pastoral plan, and said, and that's Dehesa Australis. And I went, ooh, the Latin no file in me went, oh, that's interesting.
Yes, you had a little swagger at that moment.
I had to go outside for air. But so the Dehesa Australis project is actually, it calls for some things in particular. I can't remember all of the bullet points, but it's basically wanting to recognize all of those species that have potential for that application in Australia, then locate all of those species and varieties that we have in Australia, then find the ones that we don't have in Australia and establish like some kind of import relationship with the right bodies to make that, quarantine, all streamline, and then to establish physical living arboretums of these trees as wherever we can, hopefully within each bioregion. And so that's Dehesa Australis.
Well, it's a brilliant vision, and it's interesting when I consider the first time I ever read about the Dehesa was I was a child. I got this book I can't remember, I've still got it somewhere. I got this book on a young bullfighter. Well, his father was a bullfighter, and he was going to be a bullfighter, and I think he was about the same age as me at the time, 7 or 8 or whatever. And of course, the landscape that he was in was the Dehesa, because if you go to Extremadura and all through there into the Salamanca area, those famous areas of Spain, that's the landscape, and that was the backdrop to the photographs, which were full size. I think it was an A4 book or bigger, and it had full size photos. That was a beautiful book. So I remember the name of it, but thinking of that landscape, and then ultimately reading about it in my journey with, especially with my agroforestry journey, and then in permaculture, but more so in agroforestry, it was more known about, and then understanding too that a lot of our landscape here in Australia mimic that, and then traveling as I did ultimately to Spain and to other parts of the world, including Chile and Argentina and California. You bore witness to these Mediterranean woodlands, grassy woodlands. So the system is not specific, or the layout, as I would call it, is not specific to Iberia, but in terms of all of its dimensions, it certainly is a very specific one to Spain and Portugal. Yeah,
well, the savanna biome in and of itself isn't rare.
No,
and it stretches across there are different kind of climatic conditions that it seems to pop up in. And I guess who was it? Is it Peter Allen?
Yes. Yeah.
He wrote. I think he either wrote or posted something, because he's a genius. Peter's a bloody mega brain, but he was right. He was speaking about that's right. It was his PV2 talk, and he was talking about the relationship between, when you have an intact trophic layers, and you have your large grazing herds and your predators, you often do get a savanna system which will pop up. Like it'll mediate between, it'll thin the woodlands out.
Yeah.
So in Australia, this is part of like the good question, or the many questions about Australia, is like, what did it look like prior to European colonialization? And we're getting a clearer picture of that with the works of the likes of Bill Gamage and Bruce Pascoe, and what's the other one that's come out not too long ago? It'll come to me. But what did it look like Pleistocene Australia? What on earth did it look like? Because we know it's different. We know it's this anomalous continent. But how different? It can't break the rules of ecology as we understand them. So,
Australia, the big thing that came out of Australia, and Tim Lowe's last book on the songbirds really drove this home, is that the big difference between Australian tree species, woody plant species, and others is that they don't produce fruit; they produce nectar, and so. That's one of the reasons why Australia hasn't contributed much to the world's food.
That's a huge insight that I've never really clarified. Yeah.
Well, and it's And well, his insight in that, I don't know that was his alone, but it was like, okay, so we have plenty of sun, we have plenty of, the plant systems have co-evolved with the water that's available, and they thrive clearly. And because you come to Australia, I mean, there's quite a lot of biomass. He puts it, and this is what Paul Ehrlich pointed out in his Paul Ehrlich, and I can't remember the other guy's name, but an Australian scientist who wrote the book Killing the Koala and Poisoning the Prairie. They talked about biowealth and the relative biowealth or the comparative biowealth of Australia and the United States, because that's what the book is about.
Right.
It's about our ecological and economic histories and parallels and relationships, and how we're doing our best to kill our ecology. Both of us have done a fantastic job of destroying the ecologies of our places, but that the distinction between us and everywhere else is the relative paucity of nutrients in our soils. It's not absolute, but with a few areas of volcanism, which obviously there's greater degrees of or greater volumes of minerals, but so plants, in order to be able to our plants, in order to be able to mobilize nutrients that they need, would direct their photosynthetic output to nectar production, which would, as opposed to an acorn.
Yeah.
Right. Which so that nectar would, and you know this too, Byron, having travelled a lot, that one of the great things that you notice when you come home to Australia is how noisy this place is.
The birds.
Totally. It's a continent of birds.
Yeah.
And well, I don't know, a lot of other continents have done a great job of killing their birds, but they didn't have as many because their plants don't produce the same volume of nectar. And of course that makes a big difference. And so those other places, of course, then produce a whole abundance of different wildlife that we don't have, some of which are missing now, but I don't know that we ever really had the same quantity.
Yeah.
It's a really fascinating.
It's super fascinating.
Yeah.
And we don't, and you look at, if you were to list, the top 5 terrestrial predators of Pleistocene Australia that we're aware of, like they've got the megalania, the giant Komodo dragon.
Yeah, like 10 foot long or some crazy.
Yeah, it was like 3 times the size of an adult Komodo. It's terrifying. And that was here when Aboriginal Australians got here. Quincana, have you seen this thing? Quincana. It was like the last vestige of a totally like separate crocodilian lineage, which was a terrestrial crocodile. And, with its legs underneath it, as opposed to out wide. That was here when humans arrived. What else was there? You've got the thylacine, the Tassie tiger, as it's known. Yeah. You've got the thylacoleo. And then you've got like an omnivorous kangaroo, or proconsol, I think its name was. And then
short-faced kangaroo,
Yeah, and then you've got this subspecies of the Tasmanian devil, which was about twice the size of the existing ones.
So sort of the dog size,
Yeah, but none of them were pack hunters. They were all ambush predators, or lone hunters, or like opportunistic scavengers, or what have you. There were no, as far as we know, or as far as I know, because I've not actually seen anyone write about this. I've just kind of, deduced it, that there weren't any pack hunters. So for a continent, a landmass, from what I gather, was, just had a lot of fairly arid, open rangeland, whether it's, desert or grassland or kind of open savanna. To have no pack hunting predators, it's quite a strange thing. Like, I don't know how that works. I mean, I might be missing something, but
well, there's certainly some gaps in our understanding, and I suppose where that brings us back to is this landscape that when Bill Gamage wrote his great book, the greatest or the biggest estate on earth, he continued that theme that so many people had when they arrived, that this place looks like an English gentleman's parkland.
Right.
And I'd probably like to go down that pathway a little bit here in terms of, where we live here in central Victoria, there still are remnants of all through here, especially in the southwest of Victoria. There's still remnants of the Australian Dehesa in place, and that was a human managed landscape. Work by Paul Hoare, who's an old colleague of mine. He wrote a book called Footprints Across the Loddon Plains, in which he talks about the agroforestry of Indigenous peoples, the Dja who were in this area, and how they were possum people, and they were actively involved in possum agroforestry, which they cultivated eucalypt trees to be great habitats for possums, because each and every Indigenous person, or each and every Dja needed 45 possum pelts every year for their cloak, and that would then become their bed, or their doona, if you like, or their duvet, and then it would become their bed sheet, and then it would get wrapped up and turned into a football, and that's where the game Mangrook started. So it was all built around this agroforestry, and so they would basically burn. And so we have so many eucalypts now which are hollow, because it's only 250 years ago, so it's not something in a eucalypt's lifespan that old. So we still in this crossover period where we still have the remnants to study, and when you understand that, you go, wow. These people really knew how to get something out of a landscape, and like you're talking about here, they didn't have a vision of a stable, permanent agriculture. They had it, and so in today's context, what are some of the visions that you have for getting that back? And there's another question I'll add to that about the paleo diet as well with that. But I'll park that one for a moment.
Okay. Well, geez, that's a big question. How do we achieve or re-achieve a permanent agriculture? Like, Jesus. Well, firstly,
an agroforestry culture. Because that's ultimately what you're pitching here, isn't
it? Yeah. But something dawned on me. I remember realizing, 15 years ago that, without getting too political about it, that I'd been taught a false history about Australia.
Yeah.
In at least so much that I wasn't taught enough. And, we did a unit of Aboriginal studies in high school, and it was trite, it was just about boomerangs and hopeless. But it is geologically and historically speaking, it was a tick of the clock ago. It was yesterday that this the longest continual cultural form that we're aware of on the planet was flourishing, alive, and happening. And I have it over here. Occasionally you'll go driving in certain areas, and you can tell by the size of trees and the way that they've grown that they're pre-European. Certain landscapes in their entirety are, to a degree, and it's just fascinating and heartbreaking to think that how recently all of that disappeared. But the agroforestry landscape. Well, I am enamored with trees and tree crops, and I think I hang on a minute. Daz, can we pause for a second?
Yes, sure, mate.
Hang on. I'll be right back.
Yeah. So, people, while I wait, there's some of the books there. Matt Powers has just asked me some of the books. I'll do a book list there, Matt, because I know that Byron and I both a bit nerdy on this stuff, so I'll make a list and I'll I'll post that. But oh, excuse me. One of the books is The Biggest Estate on Earth, which was written by Bill Gamage. Another one was Bruce Pascoe's Black Emu, and which is a fascinating book, which looks at raises the spectre of understanding around in Australian Aboriginal agriculture, because that's one of the bases to the claim of Terra Nullius, which was a legal point that the British made here in order to be able to overcome the problems that they've of their own creation in common law. So if you declare a land without people, well then there is no common law to be expressed because there's nobody there. And a lot of the lies and deceit that went on with all of that. And I'm reading a piece at the moment, which is around the history of the Dja Wurrung here in Central Victoria, and the Taungurung, who are our neighbouring nation here in this part of the world, around these very lies and deceits that occurred, where the government, explorers would write their accounts, and when they'd write their accounts, they'd then get gazetted. So the government would take this information, these reports, and then they'd censor them so that they didn't make mention of housing, Aboriginal housing, or Aboriginal crop systems, or all of the rest of it. And this was a rife practice, and of course, I think it'll be interesting to see what the legal outcomes of this over time, because I don't think we're fully reconciled on that point at this point. But
I'm back. Sorry.
Yeah,
about that.
no worries, man. I was just going through. There was a question on some of the books. Matt Powers was asking some of the books, and
my charger. I had to bring my laptop charger. But
that doesn't help, does it?
Yeah, Terra Nullius. It's again, you're not taught this as an Australian. You can't. You have to kind of come to it yourself. We don't get sat down as kids and told this part of our history. At least we didn't when I was a kid. And
it's
pretty heartbreaking.
It is completely, and it's perplexing, because I think, one reaction I've had to all of this is that probably the most ethical thing that I could do is go back to Ireland, because I have no right to be on other people's land as I am. Now there's obviously practical implications for that, but I do think frequently that that would be the best bloody thing I could do. Anyway,
yeah.
In the meantime, the fascination is the fascination with this kind of landscape, because I keep hearing this from a whole range of different sources, and have for a long time.
Yeah.
People like Jared Diamond has talked about it. Sort of, you might say, popular scientists out there.
Yes.
Like Diamond, and even people like Jordan Peterson are talking about it as far as from an evolutionary biology point of view, that when he talks about us, we came out of the trees, we stood up, and we got our vision, because as soon as you go out of the trees, well, you don't need to stand up when you live in a tree, but when you come out of a tree and you're in a landscape and you're using fire, and you're in a savanna, which is filled, one of the bases to savanna is grass, and grass builds a lot of herbivores. It's a fantastic converter of sunlight into biomass, which is then going to have a trophic cascade that comes from that, which is going to produce all of these herbivores, which is then going to produce all of these omnivores, which is then going to produce all of these carnivores. And of course, when you come out of the trees and you stand up, and there are all of these things that want to eat you, then you're going to want to get your wits about you. And so there's all of that people like him and Diamond and a number of others talk about. And I think that's so. Is it therefore the natural human landscape?
Well, I'll add that the proto-hominid Ardipithecus ramidus has been shown to show signs of being bipedal and arboreal. But anyway, that's for another talk. But yeah, I do. Like, I think this, see, to me, I don't like being in cities, big cities, for too long. They creep me out. And I have this sense of kind of being kind of like a caged animal. Like this, my animal body feels like if something's to go down, if the shit was to hit the fan, and it's a bit paranoid to be thinking that it even will, but if it does, I'm screwed. I don't know. It doesn't feel safe. But on the other hand, I don't like being in what we would call utter wilderness for too long either. You know, like I can enjoy a safari out into the middle of nowhere as much as the next person. Like, it's fascinating and it's beautiful, but it's not my home. It's not where I'm from. But there's this beautiful meeting point. There's this in between, and these semi-domesticated environments. I think it's where we belong, and that's why the Dehesa is it so resonates with me. It's because it's this broad scale semi-domestication, and it's it's the way that people respond to that cottagey feel, or that European countryside kind of vibe. You know, it's like it's hedgerows, it's stone walls and wells and that kind of thing. You know, it's obviously the human environment, but it's a human environment made up of biology and ecology, as opposed to one extreme or the other. And I love that. I try to honor that, and I'm trying to become more and more pro-anthropic and appreciate that, we're a keystone species, and a beaver, for instance, we change our environment, and that doesn't have to be a bad thing necessarily at all, so long as we, educate ourselves on ecological principles and functions and whatnot, what have you. I actually think humans create incredibly beautiful environments which are actually beneficial to a great number of many species and types of species. I guess it's just at a certain scale things start going haywire. But yeah, there's something about a savanna. There's something about it. It really it resonates.
Well, it sounds like it's home. So, and I appreciate your pro-anthropic thread there, because it's again part of the tension, and because there's so many, when we look at our ecological history as a keystone species, it's in large part not been that positive, particularly over the last 10,000 years with the development of agriculture in particular. I wanted to, one person who comes to mind in all of this, and probably the greatest proponent of the English gentleman's garden, is Lancelot Capability Brown. Someone who we've both studied.
Yep.
And I wrote an article which I shared with you when I thought about it a while ago. I released that this last week, but it was just a short little piece. He's probably... well, my article that I wrote, not to put too much emphasis on that, but the article that I wrote was where are these people today, and where are their patrons? Because patronage, the art of patronage, which was part of what you might call noblesse oblige, the obligation of the noble to sort of to support artisans, musicians, landscapers, etc. That doesn't, you don't see Mark Zuckerberg doing that sort of work, or Elon Musk doing that kind of work. They express them, the thousands, literally thousands of billionaires that we have now are not expressing themselves in that way, which is really curious, isn't it? In terms of, if you look at the history of wealth over the last 500 years, particularly in the post-colonial period, or in the colonial and now post-colonial period.
Yeah, I wouldn't know what to attribute it to. And I don't know, perhaps they are, but are they not? They're not doing it in ways and means that I or we would more appreciate. I don't know. Are they?
Well, I don't see it because I know that. I mean, I get about a bit, as you know, and so do you. And if they are, then who are they doing it with? And we're not hearing about it.
Yeah, I've often wondered.
There's no. I mean, probably the person who did the most was someone like Christopher Tompkins, and with his work in Patagonia, the Patagonia founder, who unfortunately died, I think last year or the year before, in Chile, and he bought up a lot of land and did a bit of conservation-based agriculture on a large scale in Argentina and Chile, but that was about as much as I've seen. There's, when you look at Capability Brown, he designed and built in his lifetime over 200 estates.
It's incredible.
It is incredible.
Yeah.
And I look at I put my hat down to someone like P.A. Yeomans for the volume of work that he did. And I know that in my short little period when I was doing design and development work, I did a lot too, but not on the kind of scale.
Right.
And these guys did it with, Brown did it with humans.
Yeah, they were digging dams.
And horses. And
yeah.
You think, man, oh man, did these guys work?
Yeah. And,
when you obviously think about that, and you've worked with a few high net worths. How are you getting along with that sort of play?
I've thought about it, and I mean, my dream client is me with $10 million bucks.
But that would be that'd be the definition of how do you make $1 million in agriculture? Well, you start with 10,
right?
Get down to your last mill.
Yeah, I'm not holding my breath anyway. But I've found I've had a number of jobs where I've become quite excited at the outset. I've been really, really excited about the potential and the scope. And I've been lucky and fortunate enough to have been found myself on some really, really interesting projects of late in particular. They come at a cost though, in a way. Like it's like sometimes you get really, really excited about what you can do with a client with a lot of capital and vision, but there's very often a kind of issue with management, actually. Like if you get the position of like project manager and they trust you, and you can just like, they trust you, and you got to check in occasionally, and yes, you got to crunch some numbers, and yes, there's a budget and all those things, but they kind of, you've sat down and you've talked it through, and there's mutual understanding of the direction and all that, and you can just go and do what you got to do. I've not gotten to that point because there's very often 2 or 3 people in between myself and whoever's ultimately making the decisions. And it's just incredible how complex things can get and slowed down things can get.
By an inbuilt bureaucracy that they've put as a wall between them and you.
Right. And and then when you're doing something unconventional and you have to convince every person in that chain of why you're doing what you're doing. Yeah. Right. It's not like the work can't get done, but it slows it right down. And I don't know. What have you found? I mean, you've had similar experiences.
Well, I had it pretty early. I had my first major client. I was talking with Matt Powers about this when he interviewed me yesterday, about a client, and they were fantastic. And I designed a Dehesa. This was in 1994 or 5 or something, and I designed this, basically what we would call now a Dehesa Australis. And it was the one, you'd know this design. I did a keyline vineyard and forestry and all this stuff.
Seen that.
And the one part of the design, and they were really avant-garde as far as that was concerned, but the one part of the design that they would not do was this Dehesa system. And it was seen to be, and perhaps that was because they were vegetarian too, but it was seen to be, I won't say an indulgence, but it seemed to be superfluous. Now, I don't know whether that was just my lack of experience at the time or lack of authority at the time. But, that sort of landscape is still not there for me yet. I've not had the client who's let me do it. I know I designed it when I worked for Michelle Lally and Phil Lally at Savanna, which is a great misnomer that the air gave to their property, the Explorer Air, because there's no trees there. And I redesigned, I basically created that, and I was very excited about it, as were they, but then their situation changed, and so that didn't happen. But it's a curious tension that when you're working with people who have means, which is, part of this whole theme. I'll be really, I'll step back a bit from this for a moment. I'd be really keen to have a chat with Capability Brown.
Yeah.
And so, hey, mate, how did you get by? What was part of your pitch? What gave you the authority? How did you bypass all of these, acolytes who these high net worths surround themselves with, these functionaries? How did you unleash your creativity on such a grand scale over literally hundreds of thousands of hectares of land, which is still influenced today? I mean, all of these landscapes are protected. They're called Capability Brown landscapes. It's phenomenal.
Yeah, he's got his own category.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know. We'll find out one day. When I get back on the bike, I suppose I'll certainly be peddling that. But
the other thing I found is I'm lucky. I'm working on a job at the moment which is blank slate, but the amount of times, in fact, it's the exception to the rule when this doesn't happen. The more resources that a client has, the more and more the first call or email will sound like, Byron, would really love you. We love your vision, and we're doing something on a grand scale, and we really want to make it sing. We've already put in the roads and the dams and the footings for the buildings. So everything else, we've done all the hard stuff. So it should be easy. Over to you now. And
thanks for just handing me something that's half stuffed up.
Yeah. And then the kind of the wincing, cringing pain of walking onto the site and going,
Yeah, I know exactly. Well, that's an out, and I've had that feeling many, many times. One of the that's an outcome of the lack of interdisciplinarianism these days. Leonardo da Vinci was also a landscape designer. And an engineer, as a polymath, one of the world's greatest, if not the greatest. He was a gun for hire. He was sort of like the Medicis, who called on him, and the other famous houses of Italy called on him to do all sorts of things, whether it was to commission him for art or to design a canal. And you don't see what we've got now is people will call in a specialist. So they'll call in an architect, they'll call in a landscape architect, they'll call in a landscaper, they'll call in an engineer, And so what it becomes is this picnic of disciplines, which are all disintegrated in their outlook and in their output, unfortunately. And it's really, really palpable today. And I think, again, a person like Capability Brown was clearly not one of those. People like you and me are clearly not that kind of person too. But it's a question of how do we get back to some of that and have the disciplines won.
I don't know. Most people don't know it's an option, and even those who are aware of studies like permaculture and what have you, I don't know.
Even agroforestry. I mean, to put forestry in agriculture, we spent 10,000 years getting rid of forests out of agricultural land. Now you want to bring them back. I mean,
Well, I work with a mentor group for forestry, where we go out and we provide a free resource for landowners who are interested in trees on farms in the broader sense. I mean, it could be windbreaks or habitat or timber or fruit trees, all of that. And there's a number of different mentors who are associated with that group. And like, I'm glad when I go out there, because I'm not trying to blow my own trumpet or anything, but I'm one of two, I think, who have a greater land planning understanding. And they might, the mentors might have an incredible understanding of forestry, and they might pick a site on a fresh farm or a new farm that would be indeed in a great place for a timber stand, for instance, but it might be a much better place for a road to go through, or some part of the water design or what have you. It's like, even within associated and closely allied disciplines, that holistic aspect is still largely missing.
And so this brings us back to our mutual appreciation of P.A. Yeoman's scale of permanence, and something that I've done a lot to bring up to the fore through our own platform, which is based on it. But that Yeomans really cracked a code there, didn't he?
My word, absolutely, incredibly so. Like, I mean, that hierarchy of decision making based on permanence. I mean, it's not just a code; it's foundational. It's absolutely foundational, and it, as you of all people appreciate. I remember first understanding the scale of permanence, and again, it was one of those filing cabinets in which I could then file other enterprises and tools and strategies within.
Not just file, but also file order, or order your files. I think of it that just as we've been talking, it's kind of like the golden rule, the way I look at it, or the Fibonacci. Those sorts. It's like to me, it's of a similar order of significance. The keyline scale of permanence,
right?
In that it's kind of people try, but it's kind of immutable. It's not mathematical as is the Fibonacci sequence or the golden rule. It's not of that kind, but in the sense of us trying to make sense of where to put things and the order in which we should think about the assembly of things, because that's the golden rule is primarily applied to architecture. How do you apply the golden rule to tree spacing?
Yeah, well, it's funny you say that, because I've got a dear friend of mine who's a doctor, a PhD in architecture, and she's brilliant. She's a genius. And I went in to see her the other day, and she's got this amazing library in her office, and she's a cartography freak.
Mm.
And she's got these incredible books on maps from, you know, back in the day, and all these like new avant-garde ones. And with, I got talking to her about, you know, landscape design and function and form and the hierarchy of decision making. And because I asked her, I was curious. I was like, shit, there's a lot that goes on in architecture. Do you guys have like a methodology, a hierarchy of, you know, design decision making? She was like, not really. And I said, well, anything like, you know, the key line scale of permanence. She was like, what's that? And I was like, oh God, okay. Of course you're not aware. You know, it didn't surprise me, but I was like, okay, we got to talk about this. Like, there's this, it's one of the most important developments in conscious land design ever. And it's Australian, and the academics aren't aware of it. And the kids being taught landscape design and landscape architecture at universities aren't even aware of it. So we're talking now, me going in and doing a couple of lectures on it just to get it in there. I mean, it's not even a blip on the radar.
No, and it is such a profound process. I wonder too, though. I mean, again, coming back to that, you know, trying to put something that's immediately interdisciplinary, because that's what the scale of permanence is, into a discipline. How much of a challenge that might be to the complexity of those organisations and the inability of the disciplines to feel any comfort from straying outside of them, or having anything to say about, like, what's an architect got to say about soil? What's an architect got to say? Or let's put it into landscape architecture. What's a landscape architect got to say about fencing, or about buildings? You know, buildings. What are you talking about? A garden building, or are you talking about a human building?
Right.
Well, sorry, I'm going to have to talk to an architect about that.
Yeah.
You know, I'm starting to stray from my my professional integrity here. You know, so there's so little license that people give to themselves, and that's something that someone like an entrepreneur like Yeomans had no time for whatsoever.
So what you're saying is it should be core curriculum across the board.
Well, it's kind of like, well, you know, it's like at a conference. You get all these folks come along to a conference, and they may be from different disciplines, and you know, they walk through the corridors and they'll give a polite nod, but they don't stop to have a chat.
Yeah.
You know, and there's a lot that's like that. You know, if you're working on a project where, well, I worked on a project 2 years ago in Pennsylvania where there was all of the aforementioned, the architect, the builder, the soil guy, the forester, the who else? There was the water guy, surveying lady there, female engineer as well, and you know, and architect and a landscape architect. So they were all, you know, everyone was in the room, and they all were giving their presentations. Yeah. And I was the only integrationalist there. And the lack of coordination between all of these folks on a functional level, like they were all working to accommodate each other on a one-to-one level. So there was no, so it was very it was, I don't know what the term is, but it was just two disciplines talking to each other as opposed to 10.
Right.
And of course then, you know, what the builder or what the engineer and the architect were talking to each other had no relationship with what the water person and the builder would talk about, the architect would talk about, and so on. It was terrible, and I basically had to talk quite forcefully and put forward and make everyone understand about the implications as the person who was pulling all of their stuff together, because that was what my job, just how diabolical this state of play is. And it's not their fault. It's because of the way it is. It's, you know, it had nothing to do with them individually, but I definitely needed to, and that's still a work in progress, getting them to sort of, you know, and it's like, well, why should we work with your way, sort of thing? This is, you know,
Right.
because what you're doing is not conventional. You know, it's not part of the system. Well, it is if the client says so, buddy. You know, so it gets to that, which is a sort of not a place that you want to go to.
Not at all.
Yeah,
it can be frustrating, but I don't know, man. Like, what do you do? Otherwise, you advertise. How do people know that? Yeah.
Yeah, no, there's a narrative there, and there's an expression there, and there's going to be some metrics of success, to paraphrase Javan Banakovic, that are put in there, and so on. I just need to acknowledge Shane Joyce, who's written in, and Shane said, "How good is this? The weaving of landscape, agriculture, and music." We haven't talked about music for a while, but we'll get back to that. I just love it. Having spent 31 years regenerating a landscape in central Queensland, southern Brigalow region, the land began to speak to me and demand that culture be reintroduced to the landscape. I connected with the traditional owners and started to bring live music performance to the farm, both Aboriginal and blues, rock and roll. Well, good on you, Shane. It's I think of Bread and Butter Farm in the United States, in Vermont. They do a burger night every Friday night, and they have musicians come to the farm, and they've sort of brought that there. It's Tom Bradman and Barry Lee down in South Australia. They have a little festival every year, they've sort of created the space for that. Is that something you see the emergence of?
I do. I see. Yeah, slowly. And I'm designing that on a job right now, a little amphitheater.
Mm-hmm.
Beautiful spot, like a little gully kind of looking onto a dam space. So I'm going to put an amphitheater in there too. But it's funny, something he just said about at the beginning of his comment about sensing can you read it again for me?
Yeah,
Darren?
sure. The weaving of landscape, agriculture, and music. I just love it. Having spent 31 years regenerating a landscape in central Queensland, central southern Queensland, in the Brigalow region, the land began to speak to me and demand that culture be reintroduced to the landscape.
It's I was driving around the southwestern Australia, and for those who haven't been here, Southwest Australia is a lot like Tasmania. For those who have been to Tasmania, it's dense, thick, dried and moist sclerophyll woodland, and there's not a whole lot in between places. You know, you can drive for a long time down highways with just towering eucalypts on either side for a long time. And I got out.
Big area.
And there's, you know, it's sparse. And I got out, and, you know, I pull over sometimes when I have the feeling to, and just walk up a little kind of old forestry lane or whatnot. And it occurred to me, it's like this country misses humanity. It misses people. There's this kind of loneliness about the Australian landscape at the moment that I find really unsettling. And I could be totally just projecting and making it up, but I do sense it. And there's something about bringing culture back to the land. And like you mentioned before, Darren, how, you know, part of you thinks that the best thing you could do would be go back to Ireland, and, you know, partly tongue in cheek, of course, and that however, there are practicalities. And of course there are now. We're in this state now. What do we do in 2018 as a contemporary Australian, you know, in a landscape, this anomalous landscape to the point of being alien? I mean, second only to Antarctica. It's the strangest place on the planet. And with this incredible human history of the traditional native, you know, the Indigenous human history, and this kind of regrettable modern history, and the whole, how that all weaves together, and, you know, and the challenges that we have agriculturally, and the challenges we have in terms of the lack of, you know, indigenous edible plants and animals, and like all of that coming together. How do we bring this culture back? Where do we go from here? This question in particular, pertaining to Australia, I find really, really fascinating. And that's what the Regen Australis project is, which we haven't spoken about. Do we have a little bit of time for that?
We've got plenty of time, mate. We've just clicked over an hour, so we've still got about 40 minutes to go. So
okay,
so feel good for that.
Yeah, I'm good. So Regen Australis is it stemmed from the Dehesa Australis article that I wrote, in which the first paragraph of the Dehesa Australis article was something like the Australian, what was it? So the future holds specific and acute challenges for the human inhabitants of Australia going into the future. And I listed a few of them, like just off the cuff, and left it and moved on to the crux of the article. But then it was always playing on me. Oh, there's more there that needs to be unpacked. So eventually I went back to unpack it, and I started writing and kept writing and kept writing and kept writing, and it just kept unpacking itself. And I realized how much there is to it. The story of Australia and contemporary Australia, where we've been, where we are, and what the hell do we do from here, and where do we go? And I've joined forces with a very, very clever chap called Harry Wickman, who's a West Australian landscape designer and kind of polymath Renaissance man. And so the Regen Australis project now it's taking a long time to flesh out because we're kind of systematizing it, but its overarching kind of umbrella mission is to provide a template for thinking through and designing and applying regenerative cultures at bioregional levels wherever you are around the world. But then we're using Southwestern Australia as a working example. And we start with this premise, there's this principal premise that contemporary Australian cultures are acutely maladjusted to the ecological realities of the Australian continent. And then we go on from that and ask a question, well, then how do we best develop regenerative cultures here, particularly within the context of crisis? Well, I'm looking for a slightly less jarring way of putting that, but there you go. And then there's a number of like subsets of application, and like the Sibling Regions project is part of that. So this exercise of finding and recognizing climatic analog, and then finding more applicable cultures within climatic analogs that are like more culturally marryable, and forming, you know how you have like a twin city, like Margaret River's twinned to some unpronounceable town in China, and which bears no biomic relationship to it. No, none. So there's usually there's economic or trade or tourist or arbitrary political motivations behind these twinnings. So the Sibling Regions project proposes that towns, villages, cities be twinned with others around the world that are climatically analogous and culturally applicable, appropriate, or not so culturally in some cases. And this is what we're trying to work out at the moment. How do you do it? So we're taking Margaret River at the moment, and we're looking at areas around Santiago de Compostela, Galicia. But it's the question of like, do we stick to strict climatic analog, or do we look at population size or demographic? And then, there's more than one, in this case, Mediterranean climate region. There's 5 of them. So do you have one twinned region, or city, or 5 from each region, or do we just make it a en masse Mediterranean climate thing? So we're working this stuff out. Like it's still kind of embryonic.
Well, I think part of the way this is even working out now is that you're having with the benefit of the internet, you're having a dialogue with people from all of these regions. As ourselves are, we're all, our regions of interest are naturally going to be those similar to those that are sibling, as you put it.
Yeah.
So if you look at the relationships that you have with people around the world, they're largely going to be, there's going to be a biomic similarity, isn't there?
Yeah. It's more of a case of if we were to formalize it or systematize it. But yeah, so that's one aspect, the sibling regions. The other one we're working on is a triaging of resources. So it's like looking at like a hierarchy of decision making, or not a permanence, but a importance in terms of human need, married with how much resource, time, energy, money, horsepower, human labor it takes to implement something. So if we were to try to take advantage of the relatively affordable and accessible fossil fuels and big yellow diesel run machines that we have at the moment and whatnot, if we were going to, what do we best invest our energies in now, essentially? And looking at the things that are more expensive and more difficult without these, the fuel and technologies that we're accustomed to now. So earthworks, buildings, forestry, that kind of thing, those broad scale, those, the things that are going to be way trickier to do down the track, hypothetically speaking, if there is an energy crisis. What else is there? I'll have to look it up. I actually wanted to bring up the website to have in front of me.
Yeah, I had a look, but it doesn't seem to be working at the moment anyway.
I'll have to speak to my people.
You will. Yeah. That's all good. Yeah. I was just thinking when I wrote a note there about Regen Tinder, because it seems like it's almost like a bit of a dating game that you're looking to have there, Darren.
Yeah. I reckon it'd be lovely. Can you imagine like that kind of cultural exchange if it, every year or so there was a swapping of you have a little festival somewhere around the world, and those appropriate parties and players from one part of the world went to the other to exchange agricultural and cultural practices.
So isn't that just what we did at the Rex in California from your participation?
Yeah, absolutely. They showed us all sorts of local California beers and
but also there, that environment there is not dissimilar to a few that we have in Australia, particularly probably more South Australia, latitudinally, and maybe a bit of up around Perth and whatnot. There's very different soils and
calcareous soils.
Yeah, and landscapes, the clay-based soils as opposed to the sands of Western Australia.
Yeah. Absolutely. I was like the proverbial pig in shit there. It was amazing.
So a couple of things I wanted to, I mentioned before Paleo.
Yeah.
And so the Paleolithic period is the basis to this diet that's emerged.
Yeah.
I don't even know if I'll call it a diet for want of a better word. Lifestyle, although it's not a lifestyle because Paleolithic people didn't live like people of modernity.
Not at all.
Not at all. And their food choices, in large part, were quite significant. The reason why I bring this up is because recently we had a filmmaker spend a few days with us who made a pretty significant film about the paleo diet, and spent a couple of days with us looking at regenerative agriculture's relationship with paleo, which has been loosely formed in a sense by companies like Epic sponsoring the Savory Institute and up there, or developing relationships with them and so on. And but what strikes me about the paleo phenomena, as it were, which is a quite distinct phenomena to the vegan vegetarian phenomena, which is probably the other big news story in diet terms, is that it doesn't have a really big connection to agriculture, and which is what this filmmaker's looking to explore. And I made the contention that, because that diet is one that doesn't contain many seeds. And, well, seeds, I mean seeds of grasses.
Right.
And it seems quite clear to me, and I know that it would be to you in your study, and I just wanted to have you expand on this a bit, that the role of perennial grass seed in human diets in Paleolithic people is not to be overlooked, nor is, which comes back to the broader Dehesa vision of, because the Dehesa vision is largely centered on the Quercus, or on the Fagales, particularly beeches, the beeches, the chestnuts, and the oaks.
Yeah.
That's where a lot of this visioning has come from, hasn't it? And those species form a carbohydrate staple.
Yep.
But there's not enough acknowledgement, I don't think, and this is where Bruce Pascoe's work was illuminating, about the role of perennial grasses in all of this. And we see this in California as well. Californian Indigenous peoples definitely ate a lot of native grass seed.
Yeah.
Have you thought about that a bit, or have you?
Yeah. No, I mean, it's not my area of expertise.
Nor mine, but it's good to talk about.
You know who it is? It's Harry's.
Yeah.
Harry Wickman has been into grains for years and years and years and years, and he's actually got I'm not going to get this right, but he's looking into a project to be curated with the West Australian Museum at the history of grains in West Australian agriculture, but going all the way back to the Indigenous using native grains.
Perennial grains,
yeah. And I remember asking him once, about the backlash to grain, and he thought it was bollocks. But, it's understandable within the modern context. So, broad scale monocultural conventional agriculture that produces grain, trashes the land that it's on for a start and drenches it with all sorts of, shit, glyphosate and whatever else is in it, and it's GMO and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we eat too much of it, right? So I think it's a multifaceted issue where there's a number of reasons why the way we are doing it now is less than ideal. Granted, that's fine, but I just think it's one of those baby bathwater moments where we've overcorrected and we're going to come back swinging in the other direction to appreciate what we didn't realize before. And that these grains, when they were grown, they were if they weren't just totally wild, then they were rougher. They weren't GMO. They were ballsier, rougher species. They were usually more than one being eaten at any given time. They may have been left to semi-ferment or sprout before they were ground. When they were ground with stone. Mm-hmm. You get the mineral content and the alkalizing effect, which opens up and unlocks all sorts of nutrients which aren't available otherwise. And then there's the appreciation of pasture cropping within that. So, if we put all these things together, like when I'm emperor, that's what we're going to be doing. It's going to be, silver pastoral systems that are overstood with these fagacious savanna tree species with stock running in various patterns, but also cropping, because we know we can do it now with the work of Colin Seiss and
Bruce Maynard,
Yeah.
Daryl Clough, yeah, but particularly
Right.
Bruce and
Yeah.
Bruce developed no-kill cropping, which is
No-kill. That's it.
Yeah.
So like I went, I had a gastroscopy and was, I'm on paper, I'm gluten intolerant. So I'm not celiac, but it affects me and it affects my mood and da 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 da. When I went to work in Morocco a couple of times, we were up in the foothills of the Rift Mountains, and they were grinding their own homegrown wheat, and most of it there is GMO, is Monsanto wheat. But you do find villages that do their own thing.
I don't think there is Monsanto wheat yet, but anyway, that's an aside.
Well,
yeah.
Okay, it was someone.
Anyway, it's highly bred wheat, which is the
right.
Yeah,
that's right. But I was eating bucket loads of this stuff because it's their cutlery. They eat with their bread. So, so these local wheat varieties that were being stone ground and then baked, this unleavened bread. I was eating tons of it, and it had no negative effect on me whatsoever. I mean, that's just anecdote.
Yeah, look, I've heard that many times. It's like it's the same with people who drink unpasteurized milk and they're lactose intolerant and they have no drama. So
right.
There's you can't broad brush it, but there's certainly there's more anecdotes than not that suggest otherwise, and might be too many scientists who bravely follow those anecdotes, unfortunately. I've just been scanning, and one thing you can't see, Byron, I don't think, unless you can see the screen. I've been scrolling across the southwest of Western Australia just to give some people who are while they're listening a bit of a sense of the scale of this part of the world. It's quite considerable. I'll just pop the counter on there. So we're looking at an area that's about 300, so about 200 miles wide before you get to the desert, but then, on the edge of the wheat belt. And then it's probably functionally about 700 kilometers long, if you like, in latitudinal terms.
Are you on Google Earth?
Yeah.
So are you're hovering above Southwest Australia?
Yeah.
So can folks see? You've got different shades. You've got like the red browns of the desert.
Yeah.
And then within the very southwest tip, there's the dark green.
Yeah.
So the dark green is the woodlands that's all regrowth. Everything was logged. So the lighter green is pasture, is agriculture.
Yeah.
So once upon a time it was, well, actually not sure exactly what it looked like, but and then when you push out the agricultural lands, you see as it goes from greener to browner as you head northeast.
Tanner, yes.
And then it hits a really definitive change in color to like a darker brown.
Yeah.
That's the dry mallee woodland of the wheat belt. So all of that merged as woodland once upon a time, and that's that is the wheat belt. That's one of the biggest deforestation events in human history, right there.
And it's a very, like, there's a very distinctive man-made line that defines where that ends and where that begins. One of the things that I wanted to touch on here, and I relate this to, because so much of, as you know, in my simple mind, Byron, relates back to Australian rules football, as I just acknowledged my darling for bringing me another.
Whoa, look at that thing.
Look at that. She's even giving me her cup.
I thought I ordered the large cappuccino.
This is a hot chocolate.
Hot chocolate.
Right. But one of the things, as I relate things back to Australian rules football, having just started the season, is that the Indigenous peoples of southwestern Western Australia. It was some of the biggest people in Australia, and they were very tall, very athletic, and they have a completely disproportionate representation as elite players in the Australian football game to pretty well any other ethnic group. And a part of that is, and I'm just hovering over a part of the landscape here, is that this landscape in our imaginings, following through this theme here, was not just a landscape of savanna and probably grassy woodland, but it was also a landscape of a lot of water.
A lot of water.
And so a lot of, we're looking at a landscape here, people, where you can see these chains of ponds and you can see that they're salted. And that salting, as I understand it, is pretty recent, like within living memory.
Yeah.
These were all freshwater lakes that have been made saline by agriculture, by crop annual crop agriculture, and it's a disaster.
Yeah, it is a disaster. It's terrifying. I actually just posted onto Neil Spackman's Dryland Restoration Facebook page a little clip of a Chinese land rehabilitation enterprise, which was specifically saline, like how to reduce this the huge area. The Yellow River Delta was like 0.06 salinity or something. Sorry, 0.5 or 6 salinity. So how do they go about restoring that? And of course, they have the luxury of not being obsessed with using only native and endemic species. But
and they're not obsessed with personal freedom either.
Yeah, well, that's right. Do it or else. But this whole area of southwestern Australia, you can see that is green. That particularly toward the coast is what we call the Swan Coastal Plain, which is backed by the Scarp. That Swan Coastal Plain, which is probably like 500 or 600 kilometers if you include the Cape region down the south. That was it was wetlands. It was just dotted with these, and there's still a few of them.
Yeah,
I'm talking like 1%, if that. But these beautiful wetland systems. I mean, you imagine
the final filter. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So you can imagine the food that the local mob would have had between that edge effect between 600k of coast, just inland from which there was wetlands running all up and down it, and occasionally with like large estuarine river systems like the Swan River and the Peel Inlet, and then all the woodland backing onto that, and then the hills just behind that. So there was, within 1 or 2 days walk from anywhere, there were really varied ecosystems that they could take advantage of. And I mean, these swamps, these wetlands, I mean, they just, the amount of waterfowl and turtles and edible
marron.
Let's not forget the marron.
Don't forget.
I mean, even as a kid, man, I remember it was just ubiquitous that you'd go down to the river and you'd throw a prawn net in and a crab net in the water, and you would sit on the river and just gorge yourself with like world-class seafood and think nothing of it. It was hyper abundant.
And of course, as I started this conversation, that in the Indigenous people, that was reflected in their form. Yeah,
and funny though, isn't it, that the world's worst agricultural soils are there?
Yes,
like they're high acidic hydrophobic sands.
Yeah,
in some of the places,
and yet they threw up. Well, it's interesting because the Jaja Wurrung, which is the nation in which I currently reside, we had similar attributes and a similar situation, except that this is all in all of the waters where we are go inland. So all of the rivers flow inland towards the Murray River. Right. And again, chains of ponds, lots of wetlands, and very acidic and not quite as bad a soils as you have in parts of WA there, but still, the point being I was getting to is that the people, Indigenous people here, were renowned for their size and their strength and all of that, and that's largely a function of this agroecology, or this agroforestry landscape, which also had an abundance of aquaculture foods.
Yeah.
And I remember being out at Katanning doing a workshop a few years ago, and a consultancy on a property, and the grandmother was there, and she was telling me that one of the lakes the place is just, I mean, you just drive through, it's an outstanding landscape. I mean, it's just so beautiful with all of these ponds. It's like someone made it. It's well, you think, what was God thinking here? Because it's certainly it's a landscape on a grand scale, and you can see it and you can think, oh my. And once you know that 30, 40, 50 years ago, these ponds that are there were actually fresh.
Yeah.
They're everywhere and they're big.
Yep.
And their frequency, and you just think, man, did we get this wrong? It's
my word. Absolutely.
And I just wonder, I mean, my great wondering about this now is how do you, of course, bring that back? And really, I think our conversation today is really honing in on that point, that we're trying to, in today's economic context, restore a landscape. And this is not a small effort. I mean, this is a very, very big landscape with, thousands of landholders with thousands of different ambitions and debts. And
yes, in a country where labour costs are some of the highest in the world.
Yeah, well, I mean, you can't get a person to work on a farm, if you can even find them, for 25 or 30 bucks an hour at least.
Yeah.
And the whole system is geared towards annualization, but it is declining rapidly. And yet
terrifying. Yeah.
It is. And at what point is the tipping? And this is where I wanted to lead to you. You've got a new agriculture minister in Western Australia who has taken a liking to Charlie Massey.
Yes.
And that's, well, people don't have much faith in politics, but sometimes that doesn't hurt, does it?
I may have entree to that minister. Yes. I'll tell you more later.
Well, I'd just like to talk about the whole situation there in terms of the politic and when you think of inducements and you think of pathways and extension, and I mean, this is a generational project because it's not happened overnight and it can't be sorted overnight. But what are some of the things that you
I don't know how, man. Like this is the thing. Like we without sounding arrogant, to a very large degree, we know what to do. I say we, those who have spent the time thinking about it and studying it, and if the resources were there, and if the political will and the social will and the resources were there, we know what to do within reason. But like, how the hell do we get to that point? I don't know.
Well, I think Charlie's great book, The Reed Warbler, for those of you who haven't seen that, it's I think probably the most important book that's been written on regenerative agriculture, in the sense of it's basically being a book of case studies, of human case studies of regenerative agriculture and its history, at least here in Australia over the last 80 years, and the people involved. That there wasn't a small amount of focus on Western Australia, on people like Ron Watkins and others who are really leading, who are leaders.
Right.
And a number of others, cereal growers, some of whose names escape my memory right now. But so there are obviously people who've got this sorted on a whole number of levels.
Yeah, and there's interest now. I've shared some information with you. The Dutch Regen Ag Investment Agency, Common Land, doing a feasibility study to see what it would take to literally turn the wheat belt, or some of it or a lot of it, into a silver pastoral system and rehabilitate the waterways. And I don't know, they've written a report and they've crunched some numbers, and I don't know whether there's a thumbs up or down or what's happened on that end of the decision making, but they're thinking about it. Yeah,
it's an interesting one. It's sort of like, when is the penny going to drop on things like pasture cropping and on things like no-kill cropping? I think pasture cropping would come sooner than no-kill, because no-kill is I would think, well, no-kill for me is a system that, I'm thinking very basically here, because you can't even get the tree conversation started yet without actually having the transition of the cropping systems, right? So no-kill cropping is more of a livestock system that grows occasional cereal crops, whereas pasture cropping is a much more classic answer to a better answer to the classic mixed farming operation that a lot of people will want to have. But one of the big problems that I see with all of this, and I've talked with a number of cereal growing friends of ours, is that they don't really want to have livestock anymore. They like the lifestyle that a livestockless landscape gives them.
Yeah,
that is very concerning.
Yeah, I've heard that a fair bit as well. Especially, I mean, I'm from dairy country, and it's just, there's like 2 dairies left down here. I've got to pause again.
No problem, my friend. Well, I'll just answer a few questions that I've got here. Aaron Hackett, I don't know if you're still there, but you've asked what's up with Podolinsky down here. Well, I was talking to someone, I can't remember, about Alex Podolinsky, or was I reading? And that's who I think you might be referring to, and not his son Peter. I do know that Peter is running the biodynamic marketing company and all of that. I'm assuming that Alexi is still alive. I've not heard otherwise, but one of the most powerful figures in the biodynamic movement. And I would say the primary driver of its popularity as a farming system here in Australia, including over here in Western Australia, or over there in Western Australia. I don't know what's happening with Alex, but he would be a very advanced age now. I think he'd have to be in his late 80s or early 90s even. And also, yes, teach like a feral pig. Yeah, that's an interesting one for identity. I'm gathering you weren't born that way with that name. When I'm emperor, laugh, laugh, laugh. So yes, we'll smile, smile, smile. Yes, indeed. And I remember Bill Mollison often saying, "When I'm emperor," but he was very serious about that. Although he never took it any further, of course. So Byron, people let's talk about some of the people that you might have come across in WA who are of note.
I'm back.
Yep, I heard you. Yep. Ron Watkins is I've never met Ron, but he's always been a figure that I've admired, and it was good to read his story in greater depth in The Reed Warbler by Charlie Massey. Have you come across much of his work, or met him, or seen his farm and stuff?
No, aware of, but not crossed paths with him.
Mm-hmm. And what other figures? I mean, he's one of those earlier figures in regenerative agriculture, permaculture, keyline, etc., land care in Western Australia. Yeah. Are there any other figures that sort of you wanted to talk about who are?
I mean, there's some interesting cats in WA. He's not regen ag so much, but Jeff Nugent, real like first generation permaculturalist. He wrote the book Permaculture Plants back in 1991, I think it was.
Yeah.
Pre-internet, it was like the first book on on permaculture plants, and he's a bit of a horticultural guru. So he lives down in Nannup.
Well, he's a bit of an ethnobotanist and
plant
collector, and a lovely fellow.
Lovely guy. Like, he looks like Gandalf the wizard, and travels quietly and humbly around the world. He's got a lot of projects in Africa, and his property is a repository for all sorts of wonderful and bizarre plants. And I remember it's like the first time I ever taught in a PDC on plants. It was in Margaret River, and I'd not met Jeff at that stage, but I remember about to start teaching, and he was in the back. I thought, oh, shit.
Yeah, I know that feeling.
The guy who wrote the book is in the back with a notebook watching me.
Did he heckle you?
No, not at all. He's so lovely. He wouldn't. He's not a Mollison.
No. Yeah.
Who else in WA in terms of like pioneers? Geez. I don't know.
Well, even contemporaries, people out there who are really kicking some goals.
You got Jeff and Michelle, who, my God,
Jeff
Powell, Michelle McManus at Southampton Homestead, who have just put in the most heroic effort over the last 5 or 6 years, what it's been, to develop and run their pasture raised chook. That's chicken.
So they're down here. Where are they? They're down here, Southampton. So get a sense where my hand is there. So they're kind of right on the edge of the woodlands, and before you move to that, into the higher rainfall wheat belt.
Yes, so those guys they're a bit of a super couple. Very, very capable, both with kind of corporate consulting backgrounds, and they've jumped through the hoops, and they've kind of beaten the path in WA for a lot of getting past a lot of the bureaucracy that is in the way of certain things like on-site micro abattoirs and what have you.
Yeah.
There's a lot of up and comers in WA. There's a real sense of, backtrack a little bit. Western Australia has always kept itself afloat by its mineral extraction, mining industry.
And that area that, just so people understand, what I'm looking at now on the screen is the world's biggest lithium mine.
Which is underneath Southampton.
Yeah.
And lithium's getting...
Well, it's the new gold, isn't it? It's one of the new currencies that drives our Muskian economy.
Yeah, that's right. Battery walls. So, but there's been a bit of a bust in the West Australian mining industry. So they're looking at non-service economies and like what are they going to do to keep it afloat in the meantime? And agriculture and tourism is where it's landed. So you can watch it. You can watch it. It's palpable. You can watch it like a drip feed. Just these enterprises and programs and popping up all throughout WA at the moment with agriculture and tourism. It's not being done the way I would like it necessarily all the time, but it's something there to be leveraged. But Australia at large, and certainly Western Australia, not just the southwest, but up the north, like the Fitzroy River, and there's a lot of fresh water that just runs straight out into the ocean in WA.
The Fitzroy River has the biggest discharge of any river in Australia, but it only runs once a year,
right? Which
is incredible.
There's very little development around them, but basically what I'm getting at is that there's talks of turning much of Australia, certainly Western Australia, into a food bowl for Asia. So that's on the tip of a lot of people's tongue at the moment. Is this we're all for agricultural development and indeed even tourist development, but to what end and the means in which it's being done? It's
well, that's it. Because again, and coming back to a lot of our themes, we've got a scenario where the prevailing orthodoxy on agriculture is not regenerative, and but it is and it isn't, because there's some really interesting tensions that I see on that, because there are so many, and I think holistic management's done a really great job of this, and I think that, again, Charlie did a really fantastic job with the reed warbler of profiling a lot of these people. But the holistic management movement, writ large, has in the people who have been attracted to that movement have been in large part at least in Australia, I can say, have been a lot of the wealthy landholders and of that class of person. We are a great egalitarian society, but classes still do exist, and there's a lot of people who are within the holistic management movement who wield a reasonable amount of political weight, and I think that's why it's so important that Charlie wrote his book, because they're like, in large part, they've been like Jeff Nugent's. They've just got about their work, and they haven't made a song and dance about it. They haven't really told people about what they're doing. But when you actually look at it, and then when you look at those successes, and they're incredible, and they're powerful, and the volume of food that they're producing with the resources that they're applying, it's some of the most efficient food production in the world, if not the. When you consider the land resource, the rainfall input, and the human, the productive labour units that are put into a system, and how many calories of energy are produced, it's quite phenomenal. And that story, I think, is the one. That's why I was sort of angling towards the political discussion. Right, well, if you're going to start going down this pathway where we're looking to, and I've just got on the screen here, basically the top half of Australia, which is savanna. Savanna. It's probably about a third of our continent. That if we're going to start to amp up production there, then we damn well want to be careful, because otherwise we're going to end up with what happened down here, aren't we? Yeah,
my word. And I mean, what else can you do? I mean, look at this. I wonder. I ask you a question, Darren. Like, if hypothetically speaking, if all human inhabitants were to leave the Australian continent tomorrow, what do you think would occur in terms of desertification of Australia?
Well, it's a question I often pose to myself, especially when I've driven through a lot of this area and worked in a lot of this area in the top end, and also down in the more humid south. I think the humid south is a bit different, because wherever as you understand the savoury bitterness scale, biodiversity will increase. The big thing that concerns me, however, is the lack of trophic structure that we currently have. That if humans were to leave, and we were to leave behind all of the species that we've brought here with us, both Indigenous people who primarily brought the dingo, the Asian wolf, and European humans who brought along their domesticated livestock and ferals. We don't have any. I'd see that the wild dog would become the apex predator. And it is a pack hunting predator, because it is a wolf after all. And the dingo will probably, just as it has already, there's very few wild dingo populations left. It itself being a pack hunter, but it would just morph in with the wild dog. So the wild dog would be the apex predator. So
that's all we got.
That's all we've got. How well all of the sheep and cattle would do. I mean, I know already a number of properties have wild cattle. So And even when you read Eric Rolls's book, A Million Wild Acres, where he was talking about the travels in the Pilliga in northern New South Wales, there up around this region, that there, even very early, a lot of cattle got wild. And if you've got if you're a continent of grasses, which Australia is, then Bos taurus and Bos indicus are going to go okay, because they basically do.
Yeah.
And the other thing that we've done since European settlement is we've watered the place. So we've built permanent water systems into the whole place. So there's dams everywhere.
Yeah.
So, and that's something that gives a survivability to all of these megafauna that, including kangaroos, that they didn't have before. Well, that we don't think that they had before, at least in the human period. So I think in large part there might be a bit of attrition to start with, but I think things might settle down a bit, and that the dog would become the apex. We'd basically have something similar to North Africa.
Because we're not talking about like the apex predator it's not a population control issue, is it? It's the changing the behavior of the herds of the large grazing animals.
Well, that's right, and that's what I wonder over time. It might take 1,000 or 10,000 years for things to settle down. I mean, if it's quite a hypothetical question, of course, but if you took the humans out of this continent, then I think that's what would happen. I mean, similarly, if you went over to our cousins in New Zealand, Aotearoa, and you took humans out of that, well, in large part, it's just going to revert to forest because of its humidity.
Yeah.
Just as parts of southeastern Australia would. It would be interesting to see how that would play out. Tasmania, I would definitely say would. I think that the dogs would eat, the dogs would eat everything fairly quickly. There would be limits that would come, I would think, pretty quickly. And then that's basically get back to forest.
The other part of the Regen Australis project, which I haven't spoken about, is a push to import 100 breeding pair of African lion and just let them go, and maybe some hyena.
Well, maybe you saw the April Fool's joke, I think it was on Facebook, that was going around a couple of days ago, where there was a wilderness department in Wyoming who did a release of 300 antipoline kangaroos, as they called them.
Right.
And so I think that your proposition perhaps is 3 days late.
I think it's got legs.
Yes,
but that is fascinating. That whole, Australia is just, there are questions. I'd like to, and this is what the Regen Oz project was meant to be. It's just it's so bloody slow in coming together. Is ask those questions pertinent in particular to Australia, because it's fascinating.
Yeah, and that's all part of that conversation, which has to start and sometimes needs to come to an end, my friend, as we've floated about this morning, and it's been an incredible journey for us. It seemed to go a lot longer than it has.
The dizzying highs and gut-wrenching lows.
Indeed.
I might go have breakfast.
Yeah, that's probably not a bad idea. I might do the same. So people, Byron, if you're interested, has got some workshops coming up. So I need to do a couple of shameless plugs. One is, you're a gun for hire anywhere in the world, of course, as roving, and you know what you're going to get. He's going to come in and bring this vision, make sure that there's a guitar there, because you can't have Byron about without listening to his incredibly melodic voice with so many tones.
Oh, stop it.
And on it goes.
Your check's in the mail.
Doing what I can, mate. No, you've got an incredible voice. It's with a beautiful range.
Thanks,
and you've also got PDC, so you're still teaching PDCs.
PDC is starting on the 22nd of April in Margaret River.
In Margaret River. And that's
Fair Harvest.
Fair Harvest project. And you've also got on the 14th and 15th of April a Regrarians platform introduction workshop on that weekend. Is that with Charles as well?
Yes, that's with Charles again at Fair
Charles
Harvest.
Otway?
So that'll be the Otway. That'll be the second we've done, or third, something like that.
Which is great. Not many opportunities to do that, which is fantastic. And of course, Gun for Hire with melodic tunes. And your album. So how far off do you think that'll be?
Quite some time, actually. Like I'm
Well, you're
February.
self-financing it as well, I suppose. So.
Yes, and anyone who's rented a recording studio space will appreciate how dear that could be. So yeah, February next year, I hope to release that.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
You won't do any EP stuff, or you're just going to hold off?
Maybe.
Waiting?
I do. I'm just finishing 3 or 4 tracks now, which potentially is an EP, but I'm wondering whether I just wait for a whole album.
Yeah, I would just create the tension myself.
Yeah.
Maybe with a little riff here and there.
Yeah.
Because I'm such a good promoter and all. And with that, there will be the big hair pants. I suggested leather. He prefers big hair.
I like arseless chaps.
For arseless chaps. So it'll be the Arseless Chap Tour with Byron Joel coming near you in 2018, 2019. Yeah. But in the meantime, thank you so much for what I anticipated to be a wide-ranging discussion this morning. Thank you to all of you who hung around and listened to our indulgence. And especially thanks to you, mate, for getting up so early, or to not going to bed, I should say, and joining me in this rave this morning, mate. Really appreciate it. Always
a pleasure. Absolutely, anytime, mate. Say hi to the fam for me.
I will. All right. Thank you, everyone, and I bid you all a very, very good morning and wonderful day.